The gun made a hollow sound as Eliza Winters set it on the baker's wooden counter. Her fingers lingered on the worn walnut grip, reluctant to part with her husband's last possession of value. 8-month-old Emma whimpered against her shoulder, small hands clutching weakly at Eliza's threadbare shawl. "Just bread," Eliza whispered, eyes downcast. "Whatever this will buy." Henrik Olsen wiped flour-dusted hands on his apron, examining the revolver with a practiced eye. The weapon was old but well-maintained, a Remington .44, the kind that had seen many a man through the war between the states. "Not worth much these days," Olsen said, his voice not unkind but firm with the weariness of a man who'd seen too many desperate trades. "Ammunition's scarce, markets flooded with war weapons." Emma's crying grew more insistent. It had been nearly 20 hours since either of them had eaten. "Please," Eliza said, the single word carrying the weight of 6 months' grief and hunger. The bell above the bakery door jangled. The atmosphere shifted instantly as conversations died, and men straightened. Matthew Blackwood filled the door frame, 6'3" of hard angles and quiet danger. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to jawline, testament to battlefield survival. His eyes, pale as winter sky, took in the scene with unsettling efficiency. The revolver, the crying baby, the woman's desperate stance. Without a word, Blackwood crossed to the counter in 3 long strides. He placed a silver dollar beside the gun and pushed the weapon back toward Eliza. "Keep it," he said, voice like gravel over iron. "These days, a woman alone needs protection more than bread." From a pocket inside his long rider's coat, he withdrew a second coin, placing it deliberately beside the first. "That should cover a week's worth of food." Before Eliza could respond, the bakery door crashed open again. Reeves, Victor Caldwell's enforcer, strutted in, flanked by 2 hired guns with matching vacant expressions. "Mrs. Winters," Reeves announced, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Caldwell sends his regards. Bank's foreclosing tomorrow noon. Says to have your things packed." His thin smile never reached his eyes. "Though looking around your place probably won't take long." The bakery went silent as a grave. Eliza clutched Emma tighter, the child sensing her mother's tension and falling quiet. Matthew Blackwood hadn't moved, but something in his posture changed, like a mountain lion shifting its weight before the leap. "Foreclosure requires 30 days' notice under territorial law," Blackwood said, turning slowly to face Reeves. "Unless Mrs. Winters signs special terms." Reeves's hand instinctively drifted toward his holster. "This ain't your business, Blackwood." "Maybe not." Blackwood reached up and removed his wide-brimmed hat, dark leather, weathered by years of sun and storm. With deliberate care, he placed it atop Emma's tiny head, where it immediately slipped down, covering the baby's eyes. "But I'm making it mine." The hat wasn't just clothing. Everyone in Eagle Valley knew its significance. 15 years ago, a half-dead soldier had staggered into town wearing that hat and nothing else of value. Now that same man owned the largest cattle operation in 3 territories. Blackwood's next movements happened so quickly that witnesses later disagreed on the sequence. Somehow the Remington from the counter was in his hand, cocked and leveled at Reeves's chest. "I don't like men who threaten women and children," Blackwood said evenly. "Find another target, Reeves." Reeves's face flushed crimson. His 2 companions shifted uneasily, recognizing the look of a man who'd killed before and would do so again without hesitation. "Caldwell won't forget this," Reeves spat, backing toward the door. "I'm counting on it," Blackwood replied. Only after Reeves and his men disappeared did whispers erupt throughout the bakery. Matthew Blackwood, former Union Army scout, legend from the Indian campaigns, had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. The significance wasn't lost on Eliza Winters, who stood frozen, one hand supporting her baby, the other resting on her husband's revolver. The stranger's hat sat impossibly large on Emma's head. Yet the child had stopped crying, tiny fingers curiously exploring the leather brim. "Mr. Blackwood," Eliza began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I can't accept—" "You just did," he interrupted, holstering the weapon and turning to leave. "Keep the gun loaded, Mrs. Winters. Something tells me you might need it." Lightning split the sky as Eliza urged her horse through the driving rain. Emma was bundled against her chest, protected from the downpour by an oilskin wrap. The child still wore Matthew Blackwood's hat, secured now with a leather string Eliza had fashioned beneath her chin. Pride had warred with practicality for 3 days before Eliza finally decided to return the hat. Not because she didn't need Blackwood's help, God knew she did, but because understanding the value of what he'd sacrificed made accepting it impossible. The Blackwood Ranch appeared through sheets of rain, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, all constructed with the same methodical precision that characterized its owner. Light glowed from windows despite the late hour. A figure emerged from the barn as Eliza dismounted, struggling to maintain her balance in mud rapidly turning to small rivers. She recognized Blackwood immediately, even rain-soaked and unhatted. There was no mistaking that vigilant posture. "Mrs. Winters," he called over the storm's fury. "Stables this way." Minutes later, they stood dripping in Blackwood's study, a room lined with maps, books, and weapons mounted with military precision. A fire roared in the stone hearth, its light illuminating papers scattered across a massive oak desk. Eliza unwrapped Emma, who blinked sleepily at the sudden warmth and light. The hat remained firmly attached to her head. "I've come to return what isn't mine," Eliza said, reaching to untie the makeshift chin strap. Blackwood gestured toward the papers on his desk. "Interesting timing." Eliza stepped closer, peering at the documents. Land deeds, mortgage notes, bank drafts. Her own name jumped out from several pages, alongside other families she recognized from town. "You're collecting debts," she said, cold realization spreading through her chest. "You're no different from Caldwell." "Look closer," Blackwood replied, pushing one document forward. It was a bank notice showing all liens against her property had been satisfied, paid in full. "You bought my debts," Eliza whispered. "Why?" Before Blackwood could answer, shouting erupted outside. Through rain-streaked windows, torchlight appeared. A dozen riders approaching the main house. "Caldwell's men," Blackwood said grimly, reaching for a Winchester repeating rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Storm's perfect cover for retaliation." He checked the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "There's a cabin behind the main house. Take Emma there and bolt the door." "I'm not leaving you to fight alone," Eliza said, her hand moving to the Remington holstered at her hip. Blackwood's expression shifted, surprise briefly replacing determination. "You know how to use that?" "James taught me before the mine collapse," she answered. "Said a woman alone in these territories needed more than a wedding ring for protection." A rare smile crossed Blackwood's scarred face. "Smart man, your husband." The first shot shattered a window, sending glass spraying across the hardwood floor. Blackwood extinguished the lamps with one swift movement, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by lightning flashes and firelight. "Stay low," he commanded, positioning himself at a window. "When I move, cover the south approach." What followed was 15 minutes of controlled chaos. Reeves and his men had expected to find a solitary rancher unprepared for attack. Instead, they encountered precision fire from changing positions that spoke of battlefield experience. What they couldn't know was that half those shots came from Eliza's steady hand. When a torch sailed through a broken window, igniting curtains, Eliza didn't hesitate. She grabbed a wool blanket, smothering flames while Blackwood provided covering fire. "Behind you!" she shouted as a shadow appeared in the doorway. Blackwood spun, but not before a bullet grazed his upper arm. He returned fire instinctively, the intruder crumpling with a strangled cry. In the momentary stillness that followed, they could hear retreating hoofbeats. The attackers were withdrawing, for now. Eliza tore strips from her petticoat, binding Blackwood's wound with practiced hands. "I was a nurse during the war," she explained, noting his questioning look, "before I met James." "Your husband," Blackwood began, wincing as she tightened the bandage. "James Winters. He was a miner." "Among other things," Eliza replied. "Prospector, dreamer, had plans to start the biggest silver operation in Colorado." Her voice caught. "Found a promising vein just before the collapse." Blackwood was silent for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. "I knew him," he finally said. "That's impossible," Eliza countered. "James never mentioned—" "Second Bull Run," Blackwood interrupted. "My scouting party was ambushed. James pulled me from a creek after I took Confederate lead across my face. His fingers unconsciously traced the scar. Carried me 3 miles to a field hospital. Never knew his last name, just that he was heading west after the war." Eliza's hand stilled on the bandage. "He never told me." "Men don't talk about the war," Blackwood said simply. "Not the parts that matter." Outside, the storm was passing, rain softening to a gentle patter against the roof. "The hat," Eliza said slowly. "You recognized him in town, didn't you? That's why you interfered." Blackwood nodded once. "Saw his picture on your mantle when Caldwell sent me to assess your property value." At her shocked expression, he added, "Before I bought the debts, Caldwell hired me first, wanted my land assessment skills. When I realized who you were—" Emma stirred in the makeshift bed Eliza had created from cushions, small hands reaching up to adjust the oversized hat that somehow remained in place throughout the gunfight. "I made a promise," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping. "Told James if anything happened to him, I'd make sure his family was looked after." He met Eliza's gaze directly. "Man saves your life. You don't forget." Dawn broke over Eagle Valley, revealing the devastation at Eliza's homestead. Nothing remained of the small cabin but smoking timbers and ash. Nearby, a small crowd had gathered, townspeople drawn by news of the night's violence. Eliza sat atop Blackwood's stallion, Emma secured before her. Blackwood himself stood at the horse's head, his injured arm bound but functional. The absence of his signature hat made him appear strangely vulnerable despite his imposing stature. "Caldwell's making his move," Blackwood announced to the assembled citizens, "not just against Mrs. Winters, against all of you." He unrolled a large map across a flat boulder. "These markers show properties where Caldwell's acquired debts in the last 6 months. 27 families. Notice the pattern?" The markings formed a clear corridor through the valley's center, precisely where a railroad would run if one connected the mining operations to the main line 40 miles south. "He's planning to force everyone out," said William Cooper, the blacksmith. "For the Denver and Rio Grande?" "For himself," Blackwood corrected. "Caldwell's negotiating with 3 railroad companies simultaneously, planning to sell to the highest bidder once he controls the right-of-way." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Among them stood Pastor Wilson and Mrs. Patterson, the town's self-appointed moral guardians, their expressions shifting between outrage at Caldwell and disapproval of Eliza's obvious association with the unmarried Blackwood. "Mrs. Winters," Pastor Wilson called out, "perhaps you and your child should stay at the church until alternative arrangements can be made." His pointed glance between her and Blackwood left little doubt about his insinuations. Before Eliza could respond, Blackwood stepped forward. "Mrs. Winters and her daughter are under my protection as guests in my ranch's second cabin. Anyone who finds that arrangement unsuitable is welcome to offer better accommodations." His cold stare swept the crowd. "Or to discuss their concerns with me privately." No one spoke. "I've purchased the debts Caldwell was holding," Blackwood continued, "not to foreclose, but to return legal ownership to each family." He withdrew a stack of papers from his saddlebag. Starting with the Winters property, he handed Eliza a deed, freshly notarized and registered with the Territorial Land Office. "This isn't just the homestead," she said, scanning the document. "This boundary extends to the silver vein your husband discovered," Blackwood finished. "I had it surveyed. It's one of the richest strikes I've seen." A commotion at the edge of the gathering interrupted their conversation. Victor Caldwell himself approached on horseback, flanked by Reeves and a dozen armed men. Behind them rode Judge Harper, the federal appointee whose jurisdiction covered Eagle Valley. "Quite the town meeting," Caldwell called out, his cultured Eastern accent contrasting with the frontier setting. "Planning a rebellion, Blackwood?" "Planning a community," Blackwood replied evenly. "Something you wouldn't understand." Caldwell smiled thinly, producing an official-looking document from his breast pocket. "Judge Harper has signed an eviction order for all properties in dispute. Federal law supersedes your territorial maneuvering." The crowd shifted nervously as Reeves and his men spread out, hands resting on holstered weapons. "No legitimate judge would sign blanket evictions without individual hearings," Blackwood challenged. "Nevertheless," Caldwell smirked, "we have the document and the manpower to enforce it, starting with the Winters property, what's left of it." Reeves urged his horse forward, eyes fixed on Eliza with malicious intent. "Time to go, Mrs. Winters." "Stand down, Reeves." Blackwood's command cut through the tension like a knife. Reeves didn't slow. "You're outnumbered, Blackwood. Even you can't." The crack of a rifle shot froze everyone in place. From the ridge overlooking the homestead, a rider appeared, Sheriff Taylor, Winchester still raised from firing the warning shot. Behind him rode 3 deputies and, surprisingly, another man in judicial robes. "That would be Judge Harmon from Denver," Sheriff Taylor announced as they descended, "the real federal circuit judge for this territory." Judge Harmon, a stern-faced man with silver hair, surveyed the scene with evident displeasure. "Mr. Caldwell," he called out, "you're in possession of forged federal documents and have impersonated a judicial officer." He nodded to the deputies. "Arrest him, and his accomplice Harper." Reeves, seeing the tide turn, drew his pistol with lightning speed, not aiming at Blackwood or the approaching lawmen, but at Eliza. "Nobody move." What happened next would be retold in Eagle Valley for generations. Eliza Winters, one arm securing her baby, drew James Remington with her free hand and fired a single shot. Reeves crumpled from his saddle, the bullet finding his shoulder with surgical precision. Silence descended, broken only by Emma's delighted gurgle as she patted the oversized hat still perched on her head. "Army Hospital Corps," Eliza explained to the stunned onlookers. "I know exactly where to shoot a man to wound but not kill." Sheriff Taylor's men quickly disarmed Caldwell's remaining gunmen, who surrendered without further resistance. As Caldwell was led away in handcuffs, he hissed at Blackwood, "This isn't over." "Yes," Blackwood replied calmly, "it is." 3 years later, Emma Winters Blackwood stood proudly beside her mother and stepfather as the new Eagle Valley Mining Cooperative opened its main shaft. At 4 years old, she still wore Matthew's hat, though now it was secured with a properly crafted leather band that Matthew had tooled himself. The cooperative, jointly owned by 27 families whose land contained the silver vein, had transformed the valley's fortunes. Where once stood scattered, struggling homesteads, now thrived a community built on shared prosperity. Matthew Blackwood, respected but still feared throughout the territory, had found something he'd never expected after the war: a family. His marriage to Eliza 2 years prior had raised eyebrows initially, but even Pastor Wilson had eventually conceded that their union seemed blessed by Providence. "Ready for your riding lesson?" Matthew asked Emma, who nodded eagerly, the oversized hat bobbing comically on her small head. "Can I shoot the Winchester today?" she asked hopefully. "When you're 5, Eliza interjected firmly. We agreed. Matthew lifted Emma onto his saddle, mounting behind her with practiced ease. As they prepared to ride out, a boy approached, 10 years old, thin from too many missed meals, eyes too old for his years. Mr. Blackwood, the boy said hesitantly. Pa said to ask if there's work at the mine for him. Matthew studied the boy carefully. What's your name, son? Thomas, sir. Thomas Jenkins. Your father worked Caldwell's operation before it closed? The boy nodded, eyes downcast. Matthew dismounted, kneeling to meet the boy at eye level. From his belt, he removed a small sheath knife, bone-handled, perfectly balanced for a boy learning frontier skills. Take this to your father, he said, placing it in the boy's hand. Tell him there's a position if he wants it. And this, he tapped the knife, is for you. Every man needs the right tools to make his way. The boy stared in disbelief at the gift. I can't pay you back, sir. Matthew's hand rested briefly on Emma's hat. That's not how it works, son. Some debts you don't pay back. You pass forward. He glanced at Eliza, whose eyes shone with understanding. That's how valleys grow strong. As they rode away, Emma tilted her head up toward her stepfather. Will Thomas wear your knife like I wear your hat? Matthew smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that softened his battle-scarred features. If he learns what it means. Behind them, Eagle Valley spread out in the afternoon sun. Silver ore carts moving along newly laid tracks, children playing in yards where desperation had once lived. A community built not just on silver, but on the understanding that true protection came from standing together. And it had started with a hat, a gun, and a promise kept.